Well, hello and welcome, everyone. I am Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, and just delighted to be with all of you who are joining us on different platforms all over the world for what we're calling the Devex Book Club. If you followed along the many video conversations I've been having during the pandemic when we've all been stuck at home, many of them have focused on books. And I've had these great conversations with authors who are working in or studying or writing about the global development space writ large. And we got a great response from it and decided we should do more. So if you're joining us now for the first of this Devex Book Club series, welcome. And I'm really just so delighted to get to begin with a book that I think everyone here should know and should be very familiar with. And it's a book that I think speaks so much to the work that those of you who are in the global development sector do every day, but from a really unique perspective. So let me welcome Elizabeth Nyamayaro, who is the author of I Am a Girl from Africa. And so delighted to have you here, Elizabeth. You can go ahead and turn off mute if you want, Elizabeth. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Well, you may be frozen, but while we get her back, these are the usual things we're used to, right, in our new virtual world. I'll tell you a little bit about the book and about the woman I'm about to talk to, who is a really remarkable person. So Elizabeth really spent her career working in the international organization sector. She's been at the UN, she's been at the World Bank, the WHO, UN AIDS, UN Women. You might have heard of her in particular around the He for She movement, which was a very popular movement launched several years ago at the UN. She was really the mastermind behind it. And we'll hear more about this as we talk together when she is able to rejoin us. But what's really unique about Elizabeth, as you'll hear, is she is not only someone who went to university and studied these issues and began a professional life in global development. She's someone who began her life as what sometimes people might call a beneficiary, a term that's no longer so much in vogue. But Elizabeth starts her book telling us the story of how she herself was at the brink of starvation and was saved by UNICEF and a woman working at UNICEF, and how she had this very early connection in her personal life with the UN system, with the humanitarian and development system, and that set her on her path. So Elizabeth, welcome back. I'm sorry we had the internet issue, but please go ahead and turn off mute. I just want to say welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Raj, for having me. I'm super delighted to be here.
So I started a little bit telling your backstory and telling you a little bit about the book for people who are following along, but maybe just tell us briefly why you wrote it. Because one thing I found kind of unique about your book, which is excellent, by the way, is the really positive perspective that you give. Right now, there's so many critiques about the UN and how it works, about the international system, about sort of the failures around development and humanitarian aid. I come away reading your book feeling really optimistic. And I think you bring your own life story to this. What made you want to write such an optimistic book?
Well, because more stories like this, Raj. As you said, my whole life and existence was partly due to the work of the United Nations. I grew up in a small African village in Zimbabwe. I had a beautiful childhood because I lived as part of a community. And what that meant for us is that, we pretty much did everything together. We grew an abundance of crops and we had an abundance of food, and we shared everything that we had with each other. But then when I turned 8 years old, sadly, a severe drought hit our village, and we were literally left with nothing to eat or drink. And that was one of the most pivotal moments of my life, because one day I was literally so weak from hunger. I collapsed on the ground. I thought in my young mind I was going to die. Incredible thing happened to me. That's when I encountered the United Nations, this fellow African girl, by the way, which is really important as well for this conversation, who was a humanitarian with the United Nations, found me. She gave me a bowl of porridge and saved my life. And this is the moment that sparked my dream. I remember thinking, once I found out who she was and what she did, like, this is who I want to be. I also want to do this kind of work so that I can make a contribution to the world. And so why I wrote this book, partly to the story, but it's also a love letter to my beloved African continent, which it's often misunderstood. And I needed to find a way, especially in this development space, to share stories from community African, what to uplift ourselves, versus just relying on the external support that comes in. Of course, we need that, but it's not the full narrative.
Well, yeah, one of the things I think you do so well in the book, I mean, partly it's just through your own life story, is humanizing the people that we in the global development humanitarian sector are set up and designed to go and serve. And so often although the intentions might be really good, I feel like we dehumanize people, and you see this often in the conversation around how we depict the images of poor children, let's say. Maybe the intentions are good to raise funds, to support them, to provide porridge like you receive, but the way we depict people that we sometimes call beneficiaries can create a huge separation. And what your book, I think, brilliantly does is, because you tell your own story and the story of your family and the people you grew up with, it's very easy to see that the people we're serving really are very much like ourselves. And we all face similar challenges. And you get into this a little bit in the book, this idea of narrative. What has it meant for you as someone who's sitting in the room, design in Geneva? You've lived in Geneva, in London, in Washington, D.C., designing, with development professionals, these kinds of large scale programs, and knowing yourself what it means to live in poverty and in hunger.
Yeah, so that was the big responsibility, Raj, and also the motivator for me to wanting to write this book, because I'm generally a very private person, but I realized at some point that I am the other, right? The person that you offer is the other. I grew up in a small village. I lived in a township, during my childhood. And as you said, and I know you have been about this even in your book, like, how do we rethink the way that we do our work? And I realized that often these voices are not invited at the table, right? We are only brought in on one aspect of the project, when we should really be leading and informing the change in our own community, when we should be there from the beginning, before you even design the project, right? And not only there to monitor. So that felt like an incredible responsibility that I had, and something that I could contribute, because I've been on both sides of the story. And I know that when communities feel empowered, when their dignity is being respected, things become a lot more sustainable, because at the end of the day, it is the communities that are going to be there when the donor funds have run out. And so if they are not involved, then the whole thing falls apart. And it was important for me. And the book is really about communities, and not only just in Africa, as you say. I cover communities in other parts of the world, in Georgia, in Uruguay. It is really the story of the communities that we often don't, recognize, or the invisible communities. And it was a way to show people that they are the protagonists of their own stories. They are the heroes of their own stories. They are uplifting themselves, even when we are not there as the nations.
Yeah, it is an amazing thing to get to work on these issues as someone who's experienced them yourself, who brings real lived experience to it. And I have to say, one of the things I found most interesting about the book is your personal career journey. And I say that because, Devex, we're a news platform, but we're also well known for our jobs platform. And, many thousands of people I get to work with and deal with who are coming to us saying, how do I get a job doing this development work stuff? It's so confusing. It's so complicated. And I'm sure people following along now might wonder, how did Elizabeth go from being someone living in a rural community, even at the brink of starvation at some point, to actually working at the highest levels of all of these UN agencies? And I can tell you, without giving away too much of the book, it wasn't like some very simple trajectory. You didn't just luck into it. Give us a sense of what it was like to try to get a job in this field.
I mean, it was a journey, but if my story is any indicator for anything, it is to show that when we dare to dream big, anything is possible. And in particular, when you also dare to dream a dream for others. Because for me, this whole vision started because of this one moment. But I was also raised in this beautiful African culture, in this ancient wisdom from our ancestors called Ubuntu, right? Which was a recognition that we are all connected by our shared humanity. No matter who you are, where you're from, or what you may believe, there is this common bond that binds us. And within that understanding, my gogo, my grandmother who raised me, taught me also what it means to dream through the Ubuntu lens. And this idea that to dream a dream for others. A dream can be for you, but it can also be for many. And I think for me, that was the thing that gave me the courage to keep persevering, because it's just about me, Raj. I'm telling you, I would have given up so many times, because the story is as follows. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. In my 20s, I left the African continent for the very first time, landed at Heathrow Airport. I had 250 pounds to my name. I didn't know anyone in London, no friends or family, just this sort of desire and this dream, chasing it to work for the United Nations. But I had a complete fish out of the water moment, right? Everything felt and looked different, complete culture shock. The weather was different, culture was different. The perception of who people thought I was also very different. I was raised proud African, and suddenly I realized, oh no, people have preconceived notions of what it means to be African. But then the big thing for me, that literally everything fell apart for me when I arrived in London. And I found out that the UN didn't have an office in London. And I almost became
love that
homeless.
part of the story. You tell how you show up at an office thinking it's the UN, and it's actually the UN Association of the UK. Which, those of us who are in this space, we know that there's an association, different countries set up to support the UN and its mission, but you didn't know that, and you're there thinking this is your chance.
That's it. I was just in Africa. I mean, of course, it was pre-internet. I done all my research, and I assumed the UNA was another UN entity like UNICEF or UNAIDS. But I think the big thing to this conversation is that in this sort of very dark moments, when I could have given up, I just knew that I couldn't give up, because I knew that my dream was just bigger than my own personal ambition, that being a humanitarian, achieving this dream would enable me to contribute to my continent. And it's something I've always wanted to do. So I persevered, and eventually, 3 years after, it took 3 years to finally make my dream come true when I joined the UNAIDS at the time. That was the first agency.
Yeah. I mean, you tell the story in the book of how you had to work doing cleaning just to just to kind of cover your rent, and eventually made it into a university. I mean, it was a many-step process, but you tell it brilliantly, and I think people really appreciate that arc of the story. And so many people that we work with at Devex looking for a job in development will appreciate this and see it in their own background and how they got to where they are. I'm sure. Maybe we can just talk.
That was also an important. Also an important part of this, Raj, that if I was going to tell the story, I needed to also show the struggle, because it's easy to glorify someone like you sitting where you are. And people need to understand that it is a process and there is a journey, and that it's okay to through these ups and downs and to fall and pick yourself up, because if the dream is worth pursuing, then you put in the work and it will eventually pay off.
So much of the book is based on this idea that you had from when you were very young, that you wanted to help others, that the UN was this place to go do that. You then, again, against all odds, succeed. You get there and you're working in this alphabet soup of agencies. What do you think now when you think about some of the challenges of the UN system and some of the scale of humanitarian and development needs out there? Do you think the UN is fit to the task? Does it need to be reformed, changed? What do you think about this broader development space that you now find yourself in a senior role in? And how can it change to really affect the kind of changes you want to see?
Really the poster child for why the UN does make a difference, right? I wouldn't be here had not been from the United Nations. But at the same time, I think it's no secret to anyone, even our Secretary, even the previous Secretary General, that the UN does need a reform. We've been asking ourselves this questions, are we fit for purpose? And it's something that I know you've been asking in your book as well. And so I think there's more that needs to happen, but to think that the world will be better without the UN, I think it's a misstep. The UN does make a difference. Again, we just have to make sure that the way that we do our work is empowering communities. It is community-driven development, because we know, Raj, that when communities feel empowered, real change can happen. No development without the community. And sometimes I think we forget that just in the larger development space.
Yeah, there's a big conversation right now, right? I mean, you can use different words for it: inclusion, decolonizing development, localization. But what do you think about this conversation that's happening around ensuring people in their own communities are driving the change themselves? Are you seeing enough of that? What do we need to do to actually get to the new kind of development that you advocate in your book?
So I've been very fortunate that, the work that I've done, at least the work that I've been involved in, I've very tried to ensure that the communities are leading and change. I think there's still a long way to go. This is not an idea. In fact, we've been talking about, for almost a decade, and communities have been saying what's done for us without us is not for us. And we are still not there. I don't think we treat them with the same level of partnership but as I said, when they're involved, real change happens. In the book, I cover some very, quick stories about what happened in Malawi. For a very long time, we were, as the UN, trying to do a lot of work in Malawi, but the communities had been doing this work to end child marriage long before we got there. But what was interesting is that when communities felt really empowered, when they were the ones saying, this is agenda and here's how you support us, we're able to see them do remarkable things. Malawi outlawed child marriage. 20,000 child marriages were annulled. The girls were sent back to school. Again, it's the power of the community doing it for themselves. And I would like to see more of that, because as the UN, we can't do everything. The SDGs are about everyone being involved. The MDGs were not about that. And we saw what happened with them.
What do you think is the blocking point? Is it the rich country governments wanting more control? Is it the bureaucracies and people wanting to keep their jobs? And these are often, good jobs in capital cities in rich countries. What is the blocking point from doing more of what you have just said works so well? Listening to the community, giving them the money, the authority, the power to make the change.
I mean, I'm going to be quite blunt about this. Sometimes it's actually the ignorance, right? And the almost arrogance. I've been in a meeting before, and we're talking about what needed to happen in a project in a certain African country. And I remember the people sitting around the table saying to me, and I said, I think we should ask the community. And they said, well, what do they know? And I remember thinking, well, what do you know? What do we know? We charge into countries and we come in with pre-canned solutions, and yet we are not part of the day-to-day living experience. It has never stopped us. We've never questioned what do we know. And so I think part of that is also the relationship, changing that dynamic, right? And this idea that those with power should have full control on the lives of those without power. And I think that's really devastating. I think it's harmful. I think it takes away people's dignity. I think we have to be able to listen and understand the nuances in the culture, and sometimes do that, because we're educated, we're Ivy League educated, and so forth, therefore we should know everything. And we miss this important nuance about culture and respect and dignity.
Yeah, I'm glad you use that word arrogance, because I think you're right. And often people in our field, because they're coming at this with good intentions, they bristle at words like decolonizing. But there is this arrogance built into our sector where we might feel very comfortable opining about a country we've never been to, or where we've visited for a week. And suddenly, we've got great expertise versus the people who live there. And we weigh our technical knowledge above their local and community and cultural knowledge. And I think you're right. There's so many disasters in development that you could point to that are probably related to this basic idea of ignorance and arrogance, as you rightly lay out.
And wasted resources, right? We come in and we're trying to implement a solution that the communities themselves have tried and seen fail a million times. And they've evolved their thinking on what needs to happen, and we don't take the time to listen.
Yeah. So what would be your advice to people in the Devex community, people listening who maybe work in international NGOs or work in, big multilateral development banks? I mean, these are big structures, and this conversation about how to shift and give more power and authority to communities is hard. What kinds of tangible things would you give them to take away from this and from your experience, your life story?
It is big structures, but at the end of the day, we know that companies are in essence just individual people, right? It's you and I and this person. And so I think we also have to kind of hide, stop hiding from this thing of like, I am the UN, because you're not the UN, an individual who's working for this organization. And as that individual, you should make decisions based on how you people to treat you. The core aspect of this ancient wisdom of Ubuntu is that we have to recognize each other's humanity. Do that, then it's easier for us to extend compassion. It makes us easier to also remove our and discrimination that we may have against people that we don't often interact with. And so the big lesson for me would be that just make sure that you are treating this. You are an individual at the end of the day, and you can make the right decision, because there is the right way to do. There's the wrong way to do this work, and it is true development is a partnership, right? It's a partnership with the communities that you're trying to serve. That's the other important piece. We are civil servants. We are there to serve and not to control or to dominate or to undermine or to dehumanize people, which sometimes we've seen colleagues do in this space. Yeah,
that is a powerful message. I want to shift gears for a second, because you began your career focused on the HIV/AIDS crisis, and you tell the story in the book about really a personal direct experience with it. You had this aunt who you spent a lot of your time growing up with, who was a doctor, a leading HIV/AIDS doctor, clinician in Zimbabwe, and you had a lot of experience caring for patients as a volunteer. And then you went on, and your first job in the UN system was as a researcher on these issues. And here we are now in the middle of this pandemic. I just wonder what your thoughts are about the global health system as it exists. You worked at the WHO before, about how you think it's responded to the pandemic. And if you have any takeaways now at this, more than a year into the pandemic, year and a half into the pandemic, how do you feel about where the humanitarian and development response is?
I know you had a really wonderful interview, which I watched with the ED of UNAIDS, and I think she highlighted what we all know, that this COVID pandemic has had such significant setbacks on global development at large, but also even on the issue of HIV/AIDS. I think we are finding that there are glaring inequalities in terms of to healthcare that were there, but further exacerbated by the pandemic. And this is part of the building better, right? I think we need to really look at all the systems. I keep hearing people, by the way, Raj, saying, we just need to go back to normal. We want to go back to normal. And I have to remind people, no, we don't want to go back, because normal wasn't working. We need to reset. And I think this is this moment, this is this opportunity to look at all the inequalities that were already there before the COVID pandemic and figure out a way that we can support communities in need, to make sure that nobody's left behind, which is the core mission of the SDGs.
Right. And people are being left behind. I mean, as I say, your book is really optimistic, but it is hard not to draw those parallels that early in your career, looking at how AIDS patients in places like Southern Africa couldn't get access to medication. And here we are a year and a half into the pandemic, and there's similar disparity in terms of vaccine distribution, therapeutics, other basic medical services that are needed in the midst of this pandemic. It's just a very unequal world. It was back when you started your career. And sadly, even now, 2021, with all the resources of the world, it still is. Yeah. But it's also why, another aspect of why I wrote the book, because I also realized at some point that, I'm only one person and I can only create so much impact. So perhaps what if I was to tell a story
to inspire everyone and other to see that none of us are too small to make a difference, right? That if we all do our small part, and this is what it comes down to, it's going to require real change, it's going to require the collective. Even just surviving the pandemic, we know as a collective, but developmental work, we've lost 2 decades of progress. It means all hands on deck. It means we can all take small action communities, and those will culminate into big change. But that's what's required right now.
Well, I can tell people if you're feeling jaded at all by the work that you do, maybe you're following this and you're in the UN system, and yeah, there's plenty of reasons to be jaded, but this is a book that will really make you remember why you joined to begin with, and what an opportunity it is to get to work on these issues every day. It is remarkable when you think of all the different career choices people can make, and the many thousands. We think at Devex is probably close to 2 million professionals in the world that work in global development and humanitarian relief work. And it's a remarkable opportunity and obligation if you're in this field to do something with that role that you have. And I think this book really lays that out.
Yeah.
So in our remaining time here, Elizabeth, I wonder if there's any kind of final message you want people to take away. I don't want to reveal too much because the book really is a great story that's worth just reading yourself. But is there anything that you kind of take away at the end of this journey that you want to leave people with?
The thing, because I know that we have young professionals online as well, Raj, and I think one of the things that I'm hoping people can take away from the book is that your dreams, no matter how small, they are valid. And this we've chosen, it is not always the easy work, but it's the needed work, it's the necessary work. And for brown girls who look like me and brown boys who look like me, I hope also see that where we are born or our current circumstances should never limit our ability to dream big or even limit our potential. And so I am inspired, as you said. I mean, there's so many things to be depressed about, but we need a lot more people being optimistic about the future, because if we want to live in a world that is just and more equal and more sustainable, then all of us to create that world. And I think we can.
I love that optimistic message, Elizabeth. I can tell you some of the books I have on my bookshelf for the next editions of the book club are less positive, less optimistic about the state of the world and the state of the international institutions we're talking about. But it really is kind of a breath of fresh air to read your personal story. And it does give you some context, right? It gives you some perspective on what it's like to have gone through everything you've gone through and to have had such an impactful career. It's a real honor to get to meet you virtually and to talk to you like this. And I really recommend the book to anyone. You know, the title is I Am a Girl from Africa. There's a point in the story where Elizabeth mentions, you know, thinking to herself, well, maybe I'm just a girl from Africa, right? Yeah. When you're really struggling in the UK and you're trying to get to that role at the UN. And it's a wonderful story to see that at the end, the title takes that just out, right? And I think that sort of says it all. And it is a book that will leave you smiling. I recommend it to everybody.
Thank you so much, Raj. I'll give you one parting proverb, because proverbs make a feature in this book from different parts of Africa. So here's to anyone who's listening, who's doubting their ability to make a difference. One of my favorite African saying is, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try spending a night in a room with a mosquito. And I think you will realize that you're not too small to make. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for following along. Follow me on Twitter to give me ideas for the next book club event. And I'll be sharing soon who I'm going to be reading. Talk to you all soon.
Bye.